Hello and welcome to Jelim's Storytime. My name is Jess, otherwise known by my author moniker Jelim, and today I am continuing on with my reading of The Blood King, Chapter 9. If you have not heard the previous chapters, I recommend you go on back to episode 4 and start off there for The Blood King, and hopefully you'll catch up soon. Let's get started. Chapter 9. So, thought Vincent as he watched the leggy blonde head for the park. That's how we're going to play it, is it? Feeling the wind rush over his pale skin, he moved with fluid grace to a vantage point in front of her in less than a second. She was dressed quite nicely, as if she had been prepared to go on a date. From her disappointed expression, he ascertained that she had been stood up. Vincent smiled to himself. He had become quite apt at considering his meals. They were usually female, and usually quite attractive. Hunting was quite entertaining when the meal was more alluring. Leaning against a tree and watching her walk by, he saw her pause as her phone began ringing, and was slightly angered as she answered. He'd have to wait longer now. Feeding from a meal while they were on the phone was never a good option. The other person on the other end usually panicked. Vincent found this to be another reason why he missed the good old days of telegrams and letters. Walking parallel to his meal, Vincent couldn't help but find himself listening to her conversation. "No sign of them," stated the blonde. "I thought you said the younger one was a drinker." Vincent was grateful for his enhanced senses at this stage, for he was interested in hearing the reply. "He is, but public record does state that he's been enrolled in the local high school," came the reply. "Evidently he is attempting to blend in." "Can't work out for long," said the blonde. "They have to feed." Vincent's interest spiked at this. He knew quite well that humans hardly ever referred to mealtimes as a feed. "And feed they will," came the reply. "Keep an eye out for any inconclusive police reports. The bloodsuckers have got to come out sometime." "Of course," replied the blonde. "I'll check in again in 12 hours. Coming out." The blonde then moved the phone from her ear and hung up, placing the phone back in her bag and walking on. Vincent smiled to himself. This seemed too good to be true. Within seconds he stood before the blonde, pausing only when she drew a stake from her bag and aimed it right for his chest. Vincent caught it and smirked down at her. "Too slow." "It seems to be a good night for hunting, no?" she asked him innocently. "The best," replied Vincent. "I find the moon and stars quite amicable companions. You, on the other hand, don't seem overly pleased to see me." He gave a meaningful glance down at the stake before pushing it aside and stepping around her. "You'll have to forgive me for staking first and asking questions later. It's an occupational hazard," she replied. Vincent just continued to smile. She was young, but she was amusing at the very least. He inhaled her scent, sighing with disappointment. She'd been well trained too. The amount of witch brew that ran through her veins was enough to send even the oldest vampire into a coma. The Veritos, as witches called it, was designed to counteract a vampire's venom originally, but it had the added effect of paralysing or even killing any vampire who ingested too much of it. He wouldn't be drinking from this huntress, that was for sure. Vincent observed that it was odd for her to be alone. Hunters usually travelled in groups of 3 or 4, strength in numbers and all that. He would have to keep an eye out for others. "Is your mission to capture or kill the Frey brothers?" asked Vincent. She turned to him, refusing to keep her back to the predator pacing around her. "What?" she feigned. She was a bad liar. "Dimitri and Lawrence Frey," said Vincent slowly. "Are you looking to capture them or kill them?" She frowned at him. "I don't know what you're on about." Vincent smirked. "You can't lie to me, dear. I can hear your heartbeat." He tapped his ear softly. "Thump, thump, 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 thump. My, you're at a pace of an uncomfortable waltz right now." "I'm not a metronome. What do you want, vampire?" asked the huntress, crossing her arms defensively. "Perhaps you should have a little more information before you go fishing for trouble." "Young huntress," said Vincent. "For instance, you should know that the brothers keep a very large stock of blood in their home, limiting the need to go out and hunt." She observed him as he walked slowly towards her. "You should also know that they are very well protected by their sister, who is an empathic witch, no less." "Anything else you want to tell me, Lorenzo?" she asked. Vincent smirked. At least she'd done a bit of research before she began her hunt. You should know that other, much older vampires prefer the hunt to keeping aging blood in the freezer, said Vincent. He then opened his mouth, his fangs extending from his gums as sharp as needles. She barely flinched as he seemed to flicker so that he stood toe-to-toe with her, his fangs right in her face. So keep ingesting that Veritos, because it stinks to high heaven and prevents smart vampires from feeding on you. And the not-so-smart vampires? She asked, with an innocent smirk. It was clear from the look on her face that she knew exactly what happened to those vampires. He stepped back and retracted his fangs once more. They get a nasty burn down their insides, replied Vincent. I'm told it is rather unpleasant. The little huntress had the gall to shrug. One man's pain is another's pleasure. Keep those lips sealed, Vincent. I've not been paid to off you, so I certainly hope I don't have to. Vincent frowned. The Hunters Association doesn't go on bounty hunts. The huntress smiled. But I never said I was employed by the Hunters Association. She then turned and continued walking away. An unattached huntress. It was a strange thing to behold, especially because she was female. The association usually kept their women close so they could breed the next generation. The experiments that had originally created their kind now considered too inhumane to be undergone. There were very few hunters in this world that did not descend from the association, and even if there were, they usually didn't survive long on their own. Her confidence would likely be her downfall. She had no idea what she was going up against. In reality, none of them really did. Vincent moved with blinding speed, the wind brushing past his skin once more. It seemed he would need to hunt tomorrow night, though, he thought to himself, such a presence as a huntress will likely make Blue Valley far more interesting. It was peaceful inside the crypt at this time, observed Eleanor. Peaceful enough for anybody to lie in the eternal rest. She was reading the yellowed pages of an old leather-bound spellbook of the Capricorn Coven by the dimming candlelight. The wax from centuries of burning candles had been a nuisance at some points, but the Coven had felt it disrespectful to remove it. There was a slight knock on the crypt door and Eleanor spoke in a levelled tone. Enter. She then looked up. As she looked up, she noticed that it was the young Olivia Dwyer, the witch had been promising in her abilities to uphold Covenant law, but she was certainly not the most gifted elemental witch that Eleanor had ever observed, and far too confident for her skill level. If only her great niece was more compliant in serving the Coven. She'd taken the girl to go and see Vincent, and her niece had been quiet and aloof ever since. The old vampire requests an audience immediately, Olivia spoke evenly, her eyes showing no emotions, much like always. Whilst such emotionless eyes unsettled many in the Coven, Eleanor felt the quality within the young witch was cause for reassurance. She would do as she was told. Eleanor sighed and closed the Covenant book carefully, sitting down upon the wooden stool provided. Allow him in. Olivia nodded and exited the crypt. Within seconds, Vincent Lorenzo was standing before her, his paleness like the wax that dripped all around him. What is it, Lorenzo? Asked Eleanor, not in the mood to deal with the arrogant vampire. I observed the strangest thing when I was hunting tonight, began Vincent. Spare me the details, I'm a busy woman, insisted Eleanor. Vincent looked annoyed, but continued nonetheless. There is a hunter in town looking for the Frey brothers. Eleanor perked up slightly. Who? Didn't catch a full name. Carmen was her first, said Vincent. She was very young, but skilled, and on a bounty hunt. Bounty? Eleanor asked curiously. Did she say why she was after the brothers? No, but I hardly see why it matters, said Vincent as he observed the Covenant book. Eleanor looked angrily upon Vincent, connecting with the flames of the candles surrounding her. Bringing the flames from their wicks to her hand, she flicked her wrist towards Vincent as if skipping a rock. The hot flames hit the inside of Vincent's wrists as he reached for the Covenant book. He recoiled and turned an angry glare on Eleanor. It matters because if those two die, the Coven will be unable to enact the binding, warned Eleanor. The empath is protecting them, insisted Vincent as he shook the pain from his wrist. I don't see what you're so worried about. I'm worried about your uncanny ability to underestimate your enemies, stated Eleanor. The huntress may be young and without backup, but that does not mean she is incapable, especially if an opportunity arises. Are you saying we should help the empath? Asked Vincent, and here I was under the impression that she was the enemy. She is a pawn standing in our way, spoke Eleanor, one which we cannot get rid of without consequences. Not by force, stated Vincent, but suggesting moving aside couldn't be out of the question. Eleanor turned a curious eye on Vincent. And how do you suggest we convince her to stop protecting her brothers, who, I may remind you, she has been protecting for 4 centuries? Vincent smirked to Eleanor, an evil glint twinkling in his eyes. Leave it to me, witch. Magic will not help you in this scenario. Then Vincent was gone without another word. Eleanor sat back down upon her wooden stool in the crypt of her ancestors. If there was a way to remove the empath, Eleanor would jump at the chance, but she had yet to move out of the way of 17 generations of the Capricorn Coven. Eleanor doubted it would take little effort to move her now. Well, that's it for Chapter 9. Thank you very much for listening. Wonder what you thought of the new Huntress character. Is she going to be a big threat, or is Kelsey going to handle her easily? We'll see. See you guys next time.